a rabbit hole that caved in. 18 by 55 millimeter rimmed cartridge, brass, 1880s. Winchester Centerfire Express, head stamped, 70-150 WCF. 150 is the grains and 70 is the caliber. That's actually the way they would mark them at the time. And of course the millimeter one is actually referring to something specific. But I digest. So let's go. 1888, Winchester Repeating Arm Company's window display boards used for advertising their cartridges. They would stick dummy cartridges onto them. If they didn't have enough cartridges to make it all symmetrical and pretty looking, they might put in extra cartridges that were experimental. In order to make these cartridges not waste a bunch of money, they were usually made from outcast or cast-off versions of the cartridges that didn't quite make muster at each stage of the quality control. If you're not aware of how cartridges are made, in some cases, they start off with a sheet of metal in many of these kind of cartridges. It's pressed into a tube shape, and then if it's a rimmed cartridge, the rim is formed in several stages starting off with straight walls, and then at the bottom of it, pinched in a triangle shape. And then right before that, right after that, they will put in whatever they are going to do for the bottom of it. If it's a shotgun shell, brass shotgun shell, it might include a base wad that takes up some space and makes it to where the shotgun primer isn't just sticking up there all like that, or other things. It might include a brass insert for some cartridges. And then the pinching level from going from this to being two straight layers of metal pinched tightly together might also just have a cardboard insert. The idea is to make sure that you don't have a rim of a cartridge that's formed from sheet metal that has a gap in there that the gunpowder or propellant of some kind can blow up in. It will cause an actual pressure point and a wedge that could damage the gun or split the casing. See also the fact that people sometimes reloaded even back then. These mock-up cartridge dummy examples sometimes included things that were never in commercial production or were only available for a short time, anomalies. But sometimes they would include, well, we'll discuss what this probably was. This specific one we're talking about became the inspiration for a modern 1950s Wildcat cartridge recreation of it and a gun. Now, the 70-150 WCF cartridge. Did it ever have a gun for it back in the 1800s? The answer is yes and no. 1,000 times yes and 1,000 times no. Fast forward, 1952, Gun Digest 6th edition, page 173. And no, I'm not going to pay them the money to read the entire article. Winchester's Forgotten Cartridges. Paul Foster was the chief inspector at the ammunition division of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and he found records from the 1800s showing that cartridge had been produced in 1888. But the only examples were on these cardboard cutouts and poster board pieces showing the cartridges, like a little artistic display. But he decided to make a rifle that would fit it. Now, if you've looked up this subject and found this video, you already know where I'm going to go here. Why is there so much variation in the measurements? Okay, I'll get to that in a minute. What he built, however, was a rifle barrel version of a model 1887 to make it a period piece, or M87, sometimes listed, lever-action shotgun. The parent cartridge was the one that he chambered it for this, was a neck down and trimmed 2 1/4 brass 12-gauge shotgun shell case with a capacity of up to 150 grains if you poured black powder in it as a practical limit. And the estimates, by using loading data for 12-gauge shells and using the weight of the item they were planning on firing, was showing 1,300 to 1,500 feet per second and a total muzzle energy of 3,800 foot-pounds. And remember, in the 1880s, this was back in big game hunting and dangerous game hunting, where because gunpowder had an upper limit on what you could get away with doing in speed, you just made a bigger slug, and sometimes longer and skinnier, so you'd have to do rifling. So the stopper rifles and guns were very popular. But limiting it to a 2-inch or 2 1/4-inch shotgun shell necked down to make this kind of seems like a joke if you know what you're talking about. But not. We'll see. I mean, those are, and 1,500 feet per second is pretty respectable. So here are the not specific specifications that you find when you look it up. There's two main diameters for the bullet listed, 0.705 inches or 0.725 inches. There's a variation of two calibers. And the variation in bullet mass is 700 to 900 grains. That's a pretty good dynamic range there. Bullet propulsion being 150 grains of propellant, which, if you don't know about it, if you divide that by literally 5, that gives you a starting point to make the grain equivalent for that amount of material, that many grains of smokeless powder. You could use nitrocellulose or cordite or whatever. But anyway, the case lengths that you look up when you find it are 2.2 inches or less down to like 2.17. Again, non-specific specifications are not really specifications. Now, the neck of the cartridge is very telling. One of the dimensions you'll look up is 0.737 inches. The other one is 0.725 inches. And some of you just perked up because that's the semi-specification for literally just the bore of a 12-gauge shotgun, including rifled barrels being to that rating. Now, the next part of it, after the long part here where the bullet would presumably be seated, again, it's one of the dimensions was where this would just be jamming it into past the forcing cone into the actual barrel. The next one was the shoulder diameter that was anywhere from 0.797 all the way down to 0.790. Now, that could be the shoulder diameter you're thinking of, or that could be literally just the end of a standard shotgun shell. It sounds like the chambering for a shotgun shell, where someone just took a gun and jammed a cartridge in it that was too long and mushed it into the forcing cone and ended up making a kind of a cartridge standard. Finally, the base of the cartridge matches or is good enough to be 12 gauge. It's not 10 gauge. But there's a reason people brought up 10 gauge and other gauges bigger than 12 gauge when they were talking about this thing. In literature of the time, but that's not really nailed down. And the rim diameter has some variation in it, 0.87 or 0.866 inches. Again, if you have the cartridge and you haven't finished doing the crimp, that will have different diameters as a rim. So what do we see when we look at the only website that actually took out one of the cartridges and measured it? And again, this was one of many variations in what's supposed to be a specification for a cartridge that was stuck to a piece of pegboard to sell cartridges in the 1880s. Here we go. Starting at the rim, we get a rim diameter that works out to 22 millimeters. Nice round number. And then we see it a chamfering. Suspiciously like they didn't finish doing that, where it would cause the diameter of the rim to go from here to warping outward. And then it goes down to a standard shotgun shell base diameter. Now the mouth diameter for our shell, showing up at 0.79 inches, approximately, works out to a height of 1.5 inches plus a little extra, like someone forgot to crimp it the rest of the way. Coincidentally, a blank stand, one of the standards for a type of blank that's 12 gauge, was 1.5 inches exactly. Now, the rest of this cartridge matches a forcing cone going into a chamber. I'm going from a chamber into the bore of a gun, and that's it. Doesn't matter about the rest of the numbers. It's probably 0.725 is the real standard, but there's an extra taper from 0.737 at 1 3/4 inches. So that gives you 1.5 to 1 3/4, a 1/4 inch forcing cone. What the heck was this for? Okay, let's bring up something that's only brought up if you look up ATF firearm restrictions. Any pre-1898 12 gauge or 10 gauge, hence the reason people bring up 10 gauge even though this obviously isn't 10 gauge, any 12 gauge or 10 gauge 9-inch barreled or less, two-wheel carriage, trunnion-mounted, 18-pound, line-throwing, or sunrise, sunset, yacht race salute signal cannon, as long as it was designed before or is a design that's from 1898 or older. You can reproduce it. That is not capable of being concealed because of its mass and bulkiness, will not be considered to be an ATF firearm because it's not intended or originally designed to shoot projectiles. It is a miniature cannon and isn't an ATF firearm regulatable. 1950 designation. Yeah, the ATF was asked about this. So, what were these guns that were used on board boats to announce the start and ending of a race, or sunrise and sunset when you take down the colors, or to throw a line? What were they specifically characterized? Well, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company and many other companies made these. And they're made out of brass mostly. And they had a special chamber ream that had a 1.5-inch limited chamber with a forcing cone that goes on for 1/4 inch down to 0.737, and then from there tapers again down to 0.725 bore, and then deliberately used a considered dangerously under bore 0.705 actual bore diameter, so that you couldn't fire shells because they wouldn't physically fit if they were 12 gauge, and you couldn't stick in because of that taper the longer, but way longer than 2-inch 20, the yellow cartridges you're not supposed to get anywhere near your 12 gauge. Jam those in there. And at 0.705, it's not smaller than your choke on a shotgun, but it would definitively get something stuck in there, probably the shot cup. It would at least give you an idea that you just did something stupid, and being made out of brass with a deliberately slightly weakened back to some of these guns, it would blow out the back enough that you wouldn't be able to load another shell. So that you couldn't use it to point it at the deck and blow a hole in the goddamn thing. So you couldn't sink your ship. It's 18 pounds, but you could tip it down, load a shotgun slug in it, and shoot straight through and maybe blow a hole in the boat and sink it. To keep that from happening and to make sure they didn't have lawsuits or whatever, and make sure the ATF or whatever it was at the time in any other country, because you're on a boat, you can go to other countries, they had to make sure that this wasn't considered a anti-personnel weapon. The propulsor charges that I mentioned in other videos were 1.5-inch long to 2-inch long blanks. Now, where did they get the brass for this? You already know where I'm going to say this. 2.2 inches uncrimped at the base down to 2-point-something inches is a brass flare cartridge for 12 gauge. They were available at the time, and they were only used on literally this kind of thing. So where did this cartridge come from? No, it wasn't a rifle cartridge. What happened is they took a flare cartridge, jammed it, literally took a mallet to it, jammed it into a deck gun for making noise to announce the start of a race or whatever, and stuck a fake bullet in it and put it on there to fill in some space on the little sales card. That's the most likely scenario. There was never a cartridge or gun built for it. They mentioned it was chambered, but they didn't mention how. And if you look at some of the cartridges, you can see that it was literally annealed and just bashed into a boat gun and then loaded with it's called a corked charge or whatever. You put in your powder in it. You put just enough powder in it to make it go off, and you put a cork in it so it's got a lot of empty space. Black powder doesn't like that, and it will absolutely blast form the thing into the chambering. So they just stuck it into one of these boat guns, a deck gun for making noise, a signal cannon, and fire formed a bunch of cartridges and then stuck a fake bullet in it and put it in there just to fill in space. Something fun to do on a weekend when they were drinking. Yeah, Winchester Repeating Arms Company in the 1880s had some people who literally did this as a practical joke and stuck it onto the cards, and it ended up in a bunch of shops all over the country. So if you are in possession of one of these things, the way you test for this, I can't prove any of this. The other method for it is to put the cork further down, hammer it in. Well, it's got a charge in it. That's actually something somebody would do when they were drunk, and then fire it to blast form it. The reason I know about these is that I saw someone reloading one of these things. It was a 1.5-inch long brass shell, and they reloaded it with a small amount of charge and then hammered a cork in it and fired it. The cork and the dead space makes it much louder. You can use less propellant, and you can even set it off with, literally, he did eventually a fuse version of it. It'll work it'll work for a signal cannon, and the gun is designed so that it can't normally fire projectiles. Obviously they can, you just have to do mini shells, sort of like flare guns. By the way, this is where the 2-inch standard might have come from originally, but I haven't been able to trace that out. And this might have been a year where nobody wanted the brass shells, or they were just badly trimmed blanks. Thanks for watching, have a good day, good luck with that, and yeah, this appears to have been a practical joke that has turned it into a life of its own.